my first question for you is, as a young man with subjects like political science and international relations, or even on the opposite end of the spectrum, like chemistry or mathematics, why did you originally decide to study history?
Because I was no good at anything else. Actually, grew up under the shadow of Sputnik and under a lot of pressure to do what would later be called STEM, but was not then. And made several efforts at it, none of which worked out at all well. And finally, out of desperation, decided to become a librarian because my mom was a high school librarian. She said, at least you can do that. But at the University of Texas, you had to major in something else. You couldn't major in library science. So I majored in history and enjoyed history courses. And I think in the beginning of the second semester of my senior year, I had a professor who called me in. It was the first time I'd ever been in a professor's office, and pulled out a paper that I had done for him. And he said, that's good enough to be published. And I thought that was pretty astounding. So I said, okay, quick, how do I get into graduate school? And he said, well, I can maybe get you in here. And that's what happened. It was that helter-skelter, purely accidental. But that's when I found my mark, and what I was good at. And it took a long time to get to that stage. So I was very lucky in that sense.
Yeah. So
that's how that happened, history. And then during the Cold War, this was just something that came in a later stage because when you're in graduate school, as you know, you do a master's thesis and you do a PhD thesis. And particularly with the PhD thesis, they're supposed to be original subjects. It should be new research. And so I just started looking around for what was new at that time, which was the late 60s and the early 70s. And these were simply the first documents, first real internal documents on the Cold War coming out of American and British sources. And so that's what the dissertation was on, and it's what the first book was on, and so on. And then it just went from there, getting into various other things, among them grand strategy, more or less by accident, later biography, later historical methodology, and so on. Just because I was curious about something. But it was not well planned at all. It was really pretty helter-skelter. So now my latest project is a microhistory of the little town in Southwest Texas that I grew up in, which in its youth in the 1880s was considered the most bloody, violent town in all of Texas. And so I got curious as to why that was. And so I'm having a great time looking at digital newspapers and tracing all of the duels and feuds and assassinations and whatever that were going on in that tiny little town. And I very much enjoy just going from doing macro history like the Grand Strategy book to just doing micro history like that. But that's pure self-indulgence at this point. I don't even know if it'll be for anybody else except the family. I don't know if anybody else will be interested in it, but it's been fun to work on. So that's it in a nutshell.
yeah, I would say from the outside, it certainly looks planned.
Well, I'm glad you think so, but it certainly was not, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and I recall reading somewhere that before writing on grand strategy, you hadn't planned on publishing more books. So
Yeah, I mean, did the Kennan book, which was a 30-year project, and it was a big, all-consuming project. And I really genuinely thought that that would be that would be the last big book. And then it started winning some awards, and including it won the Pulitzer for biography. And I thought, that is a really good place to stop, because what can you do to top that? And so for about a year or so, I just told people, well, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to stop. And they kept saying, well, you can't do that. It's not going to be good for you to do that, and so on. And they were right. It would not have been good for me to do that. So the Grand Strategy book was, as you know, just a book about teaching. It's a book about the course we taught here at Yale with my colleagues, Charlie Hill and Paul Kennedy, for 20 years. And what I thought we were trying to do in that course. And that was different from anything I'd done before, because it went back to the ancient world, in a kind of a superficial way. So having done that, I sat around and moped for about a year or so, and then decided it was still not good to be without a project. So that's where the Texas shoot 'em up topic came from, which I've been working on for about 6 months.
Well, it seems like there's a bit of a pattern where you seem to want to stop, but then you continue.
I think that's right, and I think that has to do with loving what I do. Very few people are lucky enough to actually love what they do for a living, And I've been exceedingly lucky in that regard, because I've always had fun teaching and writing history. And the idea that you could get paid for doing this, was quite amazing. So that is, that's a shrewd insight. Yes, it's quite true. But I just have no desire to, I don't know, go off and play golf or something.
Yeah, I understand that one.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of modern politics, I guess a bit of a pivot to a more philosophical area.
Yeah.
In an interview that I saw on C-SPAN with Brian Lamb,
Yep.
You were commenting on how it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to enter politics and remain morally pure.
Mm-hmm.
And just an example is that LBJ is known for having stolen his senatorial election, winning by only 87 votes.
Yeah.
But because of that, one could say, eventually he was able to be at a place in his career where he was able to pass something like the Civil Rights Act, which desegregated America. Or at least,
and that's what Robert Caro says. That's the whole drift of Robert Caro's second volume. Exactly that. Uh-huh.
Those are wonderful books.
So that was a very influential example in my thinking about this, because the young LBJ, just out of college, actually taught in my hometown for a year. And it was a segregated Mexican school at that point. But he claimed that that's where he got interested in reform and progressivism and all of that. And then Caro makes the argument that he had to submerge all of that. He had to hide it because of the nature of Texas politics, you see. And he had to hang out with the oil interests and the big money people and so on. And then when that desperate election came up in 1948, and he was on the verge of losing, he just felt he had to steal it, which he did. And Caro talks about that, how it was done. But then if you think about it, of course, if he hadn't stolen the election, he would never have been able to do the Civil Rights Bill or launch the Great Society or anything like that. So I throw this out to my students. As I told Brian Lamb, it's fun to hurl this at the students. It's fun to have them read Caro and then to ask themselves what compromises they're prepared to make in order to do worthy things in their lives. And this is just another way of teaching Machiavelli, because this is what Machiavelli always said, is that there's no such thing as purity in politics. And it's also one of Isaiah Berlin's major points, for sure.
Yeah,
I think it's just common sense, Aaron, if you think about it, because Berlin says somewhere that if you want to remain pure, become a hermit and go sit on a pole in the desert somewhere
Hmm.
and otherwise you're not going to be able to do it, he says.
Hmm. Yeah, I imagine it's probably a bit more difficult in the political world. But Machiavelli, interestingly enough,
Mhm.
he says that the ends do justify the means. I mean, I'm curious. Do you think that
Says that sometimes, not always. Not always. He's very careful to say that the pursuit of violence for the sake of violence is totally unacceptable. So violence is justifiable only in the light of some greater good, not for further evil. And that's where he says that limited evils can produce greater goods.
Hmm. So, do you think for a politician, for example, it's possible to enter the political world and work on passing the policies that they want to see passed and remain morally uncompromised?
No, it depends on what you mean by morally uncompromised. Some people would think that compromise of any kind is immoral. Other people would say, well, compromise in a good cause can be morally justified because it leads to some greater good. You see, it's almost a kind of utilitarian argument. Yeah? So it really depends on what you think is moral. But you just ask yourself, I mean, how far have you gotten in life without making any compromises at all? And you've just started out, so look at where you're going.
Yeah, I would say that the compromise itself is probably a good thing. It's true that it would divert from your original goal if slightly, but I would say it's slightly different to engage in a compromise versus uh, compromising your own integrity.
Mhm. Yeah, but integrity is a broad concept. Integrity can involve compromise. Integrity is the whole person. And that's what you really have to look at. And it seems to me that just to say that you cannot ever compromise, uh, that's not really a person. That's a kind of machine or something like that. And so I think it's just built into human nature. Maybe it goes back to original sin. I don't know.
Maybe,
Probably it does. Yes.
yeah. Um, so one of the ideas I would say that comes up quite frequently in your book on grand strategy from Isaiah Berlin is the notion of leaders being either hedgehogs or foxes.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
and I know that this is a topic that you're personally very interested in. So I'm wondering, in terms of leadership, is it better to be one or the other, and is a combination of a sort possible?
Well, I think a combination is possible. There's some obvious disadvantages to being a hedgehog, um, which Berlin talks about, and uh, other people have talked about as well. I was fascinated by the political psychologist Phil Tetlock and his studies of successful predictions, successful leaders, showing that the people who rise most rapidly to the top of organizations tend to be hedgehogs, but they are at the same time the most likely to get things wrong in making predictions because they are monomaniacal and they're simply looking at one dimension. Whereas the foxes are seeing all kinds of complexities out there, but they're always hedging their position. So on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and so on. And so they don't rise as fast in organizations. So there are difficulties with both approaches. And I was most interested in writing the book uh, in the very few people, relatively few people, that it seemed to me had balanced those two successfully. So that was Octavian, for sure. It was Elizabeth I, maybe the founding fathers, probably, certainly Lincoln, and certainly FDR, with exquisite precision in maintaining a sense of direction, but at the same time being sensitive to the world around them and how it was changing, so that they did not abandon common sense as they rose.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I was about to ask if there was a specific leader that you think would best encapsulate traits from both animals, but
I don't think there are very many. I think it's probably a pretty rare quality. But it's a matter of gradation, and I think for sure, if you look at any successful politician, you will see compromises having been made in one form or another. And maybe they go off and dissipate their energies in a kind of a fox-like, aimless way. And maybe they become hedgehogs and pursue great deterministic causes, which also is unrealistic and whatnot. So these are polarities of leadership that Berlin was talking about. And I think it's very important to note that he said, these are starting points for inquiry. They are not final assessments of anyone, but they're just starting points from which you can trace how someone actually functioned in real life.
mm, yeah. So, in terms of Russian-American relations,
Yeah.
a bit of a change in topic. In terms of the Cold War and today, Mark Voyager, who's a scholar at the Penn Biden Center, and he previously served as the senior Russia expert at NATO's Allied Land Command.
Mm-hmm.
I actually worked for him, and he asked me the other day if you or any of your colleagues had been able to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union.
No. With some reservation. I actually did an article. Well, first of all, I went to a meeting at a think tank in Washington. I think it was the Atlantic Council in about 1985. And I thought the Atlantic Council was kind of a stuffy place. And I was just determined to liven up the discussion one day. And I said something like, well, I don't know why we were assuming that the Cold War will continue indefinitely. It might well end at some point. And I was sort of hooted and hounded out of the room, and people were saying, "Oh, it's never going to end. We don't." In effect, they were saying, "We don't want it to end." But I got mad and actually wrote an article, which is in the Atlantic. It's about 1987 on how the Cold War might end. But I did it in terms of the Cold War, Cold War competition just withering away. I did it in terms of a kind of a symmetrical loss of interest on the part of both superpowers, who would look back on the 40 years of the Cold War and they would say, well, this is now normal. It started out very strange, but it's become normal. And we've gotten used to a divided Berlin and a divided Germany and a divided Korea and so on and so forth. And so this is the new international system for the foreseeable future. And that's what I said. That's how I thought it would end. So I came nowhere close to actually predicting how it really ended, with just the completely sudden peaceful collapse of the second most powerful military state and nuclear state in the world. Something that was really quite unprecedented, it seems to me. So I got that wrong, just like everybody else. But I give myself, maybe 20 or 30% credit for at least saying, well, yes, it could end.
Yeah, I bet everybody in that Atlantic Council meeting was thinking back on that moment when you have made those.
I think they just put it out of their memory. They regarded it as so flaky and superficial that. And I think I literally stormed out of the meeting, so that was not a good thing to do either.
Well, you've been vindicated by history, it seems.
Only in part, but yeah.
If only partially, yeah. Actually, when discussing interactions with your students in your book,
Yep.
The Cold War, so a bit of a pivot from grand strategy, you say, and I quote, "They know that the Cold War in various ways shaped their lives," unquote. And
Mm-hmm.
that would naturally relate to me as well as a young person.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious broadly, how would you say that it has shaped the lives, not only of this generation, but also the existing global power structure?
Yeah. Well, what I really meant by that was not so much your generation as the generation that was taking my courses on Cold War history like 20 years ago. For example, when I first came to teach at Yale in 1997, none of the students had any active living memory of the Cold War, but all of them came from families that had been affected by it in one way or another, whether through military service or through immigration from the former Soviet Union or whatnot. They all had some connection to it. And I was making the point that simply the fact that they're there, they have survived, the world is not irradiated in a desolate wasteland, nuclear wasteland, which could easily have happened, is the product of the Cold War. And the fact that the Cold War created this astounding innovation of vast amounts of money going into weapons which were never used. Something, again, completely unprecedented, I think, for the most part in military history. So I was suggesting not only that, but for other reasons, the Cold War was a stable international system, and I would still say that for 40 years or so it was, which by comparison to other systems holds up pretty well. And so in that sense, it avoided World War III, which a lot of people thought was just on the horizon in the early days of the Cold War. So that was my argument to them. And I think they understood that and got the point. And many of them would say, when I would lecture on nuclear weapons in the Cold War, or on the missile crisis, for example, many of them say they had no idea how close the world came to blowing up in that period. Really could be quite shaken by just doing some reading on that. I think for your generation, it's a completely different situation because the international system has shifted. We thought we were headed toward an age of globalization. We obviously are headed in the opposite direction now. We're seeing a rise of authoritarianism. Again, you may have noticed in that Cold War book at the end of it, I made a very self-confident prediction that democracy was the wave of the future. You know, that was 2006, totally wrong. Your world is a very different world. And the question of whether it's a more dangerous world or not is a really good question. My own view is that it may actually be more likely that somebody somewhere will set off a nuclear weapon. But at the same time, it's not going to be 10,000 nuclear weapons going off simultaneously as it could have been in the Cold War. So take your pick. It's a trade-off. You know?
Yeah. You know, in thinking about how the character of the Soviet-American relationship is kind of shifted to the Russo-American relationship today.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, we saw that FDR, at least in World War II, was able to lean on Russia.
Mm-hmm.
It's something of an interior line strategy. Do you think that kind of partnership, or at least good feeling, can exist again when we think about their interferences in our election?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not sure I buy the idea that FDR was able to lean on the Soviet Union. It seems to me the Soviet Union had a lot of leverage on us because they had the dominant land army in Europe, and they wound up in possession of half of Europe, of course, as you know. We had certain points of leverage. We had Lend-Lease, which was coming to them. We had the timing of the Western Front, D-Day. We had the promise of post-war economic assistance, but the points of leverage that we had were really pretty limited. And I think FDR was pretty realistic in recognizing these. And this is why he was not going to go to the mat over the fate of Poland or the fate of the other East European states. He really candidly said privately, they will just have to learn to be oppressed for the next 40 or 50 years or so. And then maybe in time, something will happen. I think part of the key to understanding FDR is his recognition of the limits of American capabilities in that regard, but at the same time, simultaneously, the judgment that he made that the United States should build up its own economic and industrial and military strength for the future. And he certainly did that. Just the decision to build the atomic bomb is a remarkable decision, given how little assurance there was in 1940 that it would work. So FDR gets the credit, for better or for worse, for all of that. As far as the present is concerned, I don't think Russia is the dominant power in the dominant alternative power in the international system right now. If anything, it's China by far. And Russia is a peripheral actor in the international system. And it's obviously trying to play off both sides against each other. It obviously has in Putin a very skillful, sabotage-minded leader. But if you ask what is Putin really trying to do, I think it's to achieve immortality for Putin. He is in the position now that dictators often are. They can't step down. They know that if they step down, they'll be imprisoned or put on trial or killed or something like that. And so they're terrified of stepping down. And so they abolish term limits and just go on, forever. And of course, Xi in China is doing the same thing, But Xi has a lot more power behind him in terms of the Chinese economy and the Chinese technological skill and whatnot. And Russia is just not very impressive in its competition in that sense. You ask about election interference. One of my students has just written a big book about this. This is David Scheimer's book, Rigged, which he was one of my proteges. And David shows that interference in elections has been happening for a long time. The Russians were doing it as early as the 1920s, mostly in Europe. But of course, in the early days of the Cold War, we were doing it on a fairly big scale with CIA intervention in shaping the election in Italy, for example, in 1948. And more to the point, which a lot of people have not raised, in the OOs, the first decade of the 21st century, with the so-called color revolutions that were taking place in the former Soviet Union, we had a very active program of going in and promoting democracy in those countries, even to the point of doing this within Russia itself and working with the opposition in Russia itself. So, consider that the poor unfortunate Alexei Navalny, who is now in a coma, spent a year here at Yale studying international relations, and you can imagine how Putin regards that for sure. And that was just exemplary of our efforts to try to shape the opposition in a lot of these different countries. So Putin has a point when he says we have interfered in their affairs just as they are interfering in our affairs. I think the difference is that Putin has a more sophisticated way of doing it. It's a not for attribution way of doing it. We were pretty upfront about what we were doing in this regard. But David's book is very good on the back and forth on this, which has been going on for a long time. So I do get impatient with the people who say, this has never happened before.
Yeah, and I would also add that we certainly haven't limited our scope to Russia interference.
Oh, right. Yeah, for sure. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I am curious, though. In the past, we had détente for Russian foreign policy, which you said was to freeze the Cold War place. And we also had George Kennan's containment. So what, in response to this new, of history, this new relationship with Russia and electoral interference, what kind of policy do you see as being a proper response?
I can tell you better, Aaron, at the end of the fall semester. I'm putting my seminar to work on this. This is the Foxes and Hedgehogs seminar. And they're going to be reading the Grand Strategy book in the first half and some other stuff as well. But in the second half, we're really going to be thinking about the new international order and what it's going to look like and what should be an appropriate strategy in the end for the United States in this. And I'm framing it in a way that takes into account domestic politics as well, because it does seem to me that in particular, American foreign policy and the whole phenomenon of Trump reflects domestic frustrations that have built up without anybody realizing it, in the sense of this feeling on the part of just a substantial number of Americans that they've been left behind by the elites, by the privileged, and so on. And I think that's going to drive American politics, and it could well drive American foreign policy for a long time to come. So I don't think that's at all clear at the moment. I think we're at a period of shaping that. Whoever succeeds Trump will certainly play a major role in that. And I think it's going to have to be framed in terms of something that Kennan would have understood, which is that your foreign policy can never not reflect your domestic policy. The two things are connected to each other. And so how you come across abroad it will be a reflection of how you configure your society at home and vice versa. So I think it's a very fluid period right now. And check with me in December and maybe I can give you some better ideas on this.
Well, yeah, it's true. We certainly can't imagine what a Russian policy would look like now, besides, not addressing the fact that they had bounties on our troops, and
Yeah.
nothing.
Well, that doesn't surprise me because, have you looked into the American measures taken during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, when we were sending Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen, who later became the Taliban, who were using Stinger missiles to shoot down Soviet helicopters in the 1980s. Nobody has talked about that, and yet it was a major thing, and the Reagan administration was very proud of that and was bragging about it and so on. So again, Putin has a precedent here. And in fact, it's a more glaring precedent than just the very quiet bounties that allegedly were paid to the Taliban guys now.
Yeah, definitely something we should be worrying about. But I am.
We have no historical memory here, and this is part of the problem. And our opponents do, the Russians do, and the Chinese certainly do. So, for example, the vice president, I'm told, was in China about a year and a half ago. And somebody in one of the meetings, one of the Chinese, brought up the Opium War. And Mr. Pence had no clue as to what the Opium War was in the first place. Never heard of it. But the Chinese have all heard of it, of course, and it looms large in their consciousness. So this is one thing, it seems to me, that we have to do, is to get more historical awareness into the policy process. We used to have a good bit of it in the Cold War period, but a lot of that has been lost, it seems to me.
Yeah, we certainly haven't been around nearly as long as they have.
Yeah, for sure.
They role in it.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up China, because I did have a question about China relations. You say in your book, you're quoting Nixon in conversation with Mao. He says, "History has brought us together. The question is whether we, with different philosophies, but both with feet on the ground and having come from the people, can make a breakthrough that will serve not just China and America, but the whole world in the years ahead." Mm-hmm. Would you say that Nixon's hope for the Sino-American relationship was realized?
Well, I think it's very interesting to think about that conversation, because here you had Nixon, who was pretty much at the top of his game at that point when he was in Beijing in February of 1972. And here was Mao, who was doddering. He was on the edge of just falling asleep. You know, he was probably on drugs. He was sick. He was dying, and all of that. You know? And so the image that I think the Americans had of Mao is that he was just saying, "Oh, yes, if you agree," you know, that sort of thing, and not really taking on board the profundities of Nixon and Kissinger. But Mao is tricky. Mao was always subtle. And so behind the scenes and underneath it all, in the end, who now looks better in that exchange, you know, who now looks like they may have come out on top, you know. Nixon and Kissinger set in motion, really, the rise of China to great power status. And what they thought they were doing was creating a responsible stakeholder, but it went well beyond that. And so, you know, this is one of these situations where the outcome of what happened 50 years ago, it should be enough to make us think, it seems to me. But it's also characteristic of the way the Chinese think, because they think in long-term parameters, not just immediate issues as we do.
And that relates to our own view of conflict with Russia, certainly, as you were saying earlier.
Yeah, something like that, because a lot of people say, you know, are we going back to a new Cold War with Russia? I don't think so. I think we're going back to an old kind of Cold War, which has to do with Russian Tsarist authoritarianism, orthodoxy, you know, Slavophilic. It's you know, we're going back to Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, that sort of thing, which is a much longer tradition than the Marxist tradition, which was always a kind of excrescence on the Russian culture in the first place, and artificiality. And Putin is much more in tune with that old tradition, putting up statues all over Russia of, you know, Russian saints, this gigantic statue in Moscow of Saint Vladimir, you know, looming up over everything. And so all of the cathedrals and all have been rebuilt now and everything. So that's a wholly different world, it seems to me, from what the Cold War was all about.
But what would be your response to people saying that we are in a new Cold War?
I would just say, look at history, and don't come to the conclusion that any kind of tension between great powers is a new Cold War. I think that does violence to the Cold War as we know it, the Cold War with capital letters, you know, 1945-91, which was a particular set of circumstances. And I think if you want to talk about a different kind of Cold War, Cold Wars with lowercase letters, then you could say, sure, there have been Cold Wars between nations for hundreds of years that did not erupt in hot wars for the most part. So it's possible to have these. But this Cold War with capital letters, had distinctive characteristics which we don't see coming back now.
Yeah. Taking the long view of the study of warfare, which is something that your book does, I would say, very well on grand strategy. Mm-hmm. There's a specific quote that really stands out about the changing face of warfare. You say, wars had been fought for as far back as anyone could see. They accompanied the first tribes and settlements, and they persisted through the creation of cities, nations, empires, and modern states. They varied only in the means available with which to fight them. As technology advanced, so too did lethality. So yeah. From that...
That's a very profound observation, though.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, you made it sound good. Right?
It wasn't hard.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but you know, in looking first at the first war that we know of, which was the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, 5th century BCE, and then Iraq and Afghanistan now, and whatever our scuffles with Russia can be called. You use that phrase, improvements in weaponry. Where are we now?
Well, I think that where we are now is that there's certain kinds of weaponry. One is the implications of the internet and social media, which have become a kind of weapon. And so this possibility for covert interference through the internet, that is in some ways an instrument of warfare. Certainly pandemics and epidemics could become that conceivably if in fact nations look at what's happening right now and then say, well, we should begin developing some of these viruses ourselves and making them deployable because you can do a lot of damage with this, for sure. So I think we may be into a whole new category of threats. There'll be some old ones, the danger of nuclear weapons and all that. But there'll be some new ones too. Think about space technology and all of that. So it gets back to what you were saying about the nature of warfare changing. And sometimes the changes are very slow or even minuscule. But sometimes the changes are almost overnight. So this famous point that certainly does not originate with me, that Napoleon could move his troops only as fast as Julius Caesar had. But Grant could move his troops 10 times faster than Napoleon's some 40 years later, thanks to a change in technology, thanks to railroads, you see. And that kind of thing does happen, and it can have profound effects. It's the development of airplanes, for example, something similar to that. So there are always these possibilities there. One of the biggest ones that I have always been interested in, and it grows out of the Cold War, is the reconnaissance revolution. The fact that nobody has any secrets anymore in terms of what can be seen from space. Everybody is transparent from above. And that was a stabilizing force in the Cold War, as you know. But whether it's always a stabilizing force or not is another question. And particularly if we become transparent from above, but we become transparent from within as well, thanks to manipulation and all of that kind of thing that David Scheimer is writing about. That's a whole new ballgame, for sure.
It certainly feels like we have avenues of warfare in more than one place, because we have on the sea and the air, we have intelligence, and now there's the whole cybersecurity issue.
Yeah, sure. But of course, we have at the same time, what's different about the Sino-American relationship is the level of trade, the economic contacts between the two. And yes, I know that the great powers before World War I were all closely integrated with each other economically, and yet the war came. But at the same time, the level of integration between the West and China now is, pretty remarkable, even compared to that situation. So if you just think about the revolution of an improbable technology, think about the geopolitical implications of the container, and of container ships and whatnot, and the means of this shipping, at ridiculously low cost now that exist and make possible trade. That in itself is a revolution in a way. And how that will play out and to what extent we get back to this old idea that the nations, the great powers, cannot afford to go to war with one another is an interesting question. The joker in the deck, of course, always is accidents. And I certainly don't rule those out, for sure.
For sure. For the final two questions, I've been looking forward to reading back to you one of the quotes that you use in your own book. It quote Marx, not Karl Marx, as you say yourself, saying, outside of a dog, a book is a man's best friend.
Yeah.
Inside a dog, it's too dark to read. I love that quote personally, but I'm wondering what books would you recommend to everyone watching from the vantage point of history, or just books that you personally have enjoyed?
Oh, well, I would start with Winnie the Pooh, I think. Just somebody was asking me about this the other day, and I was just thinking back on the books that I have found most helpful and influential. Some of them are kids' books, and Winnie the Pooh right at the top of the list. And this gets to the extent to which Winnie the Pooh incorporates in the animals certain personality types, which are pretty fundamental. So we tend to give Isaiah Berlin a lot of credit for his foxes and hedgehogs, but we ought to give A. Milne credit for having a wider variety of animals, which nonetheless are exemplary of personality types. So that's one thing. I'm curious and interested in the extent to which kids' literature can open up things as well. I think novels are extremely important. Grown-up novels are extremely important in this regard also. And not necessarily the ones that you would think would be directly relevant to the Cold War. Novels that reveal character, for example. So Tolstoy, for sure, on the list. Perhaps Trollope and Dickens and George Eliot, and great 19th century novelists. Not because you're going to get any specific insights about the Cold War, but you get insights about personality, and those things transfer from one thing to another. So personality types may remain much the same, even though crises tend to change as well. As far as the Cold War itself is concerned, I guess I'm too close to it to have particular favorites, or I guess I'm too jealous to have particular favorites, but I do respect some people and the kind of work they're doing. For example, one of the newest member of the Yale History Department is Odd Arne Wested, the Norwegian historian, who is as good a historian of the Cold War as anybody around now, equally fluent in Chinese and in Russian. And so he's become part of our history compound. So he just lives across the street here. And Paul Kennedy, who's been my colleague for a long time, lives right over there across the backyard. So we have a little compound here in New Haven of historians and whatnot. So there are some, for sure, there and other places that I respect. I'm always kind of on the lookout for the younger historians and like to follow their careers. One of the ones that most impresses me, I think right now, is Hal Brands down at Johns Hopkins SAIS, who was one of my students here, but has just done extraordinarily well in the, 8 or 9 years since he graduated, and is going to be a major force in all of this. So, there are a lot of people that you can name for one reason or another. I like Sergei Plokhy, who's at Harvard, and doing Russian and Ukrainian history. But then Tim Snyder here does that kind of thing very well. So it's hard to pick. It's hard to choose in that regard. I also just like to think about the books I'm assigning for class, because that's a kind of a guide. So for the Foxes and Hedgehogs class, in addition to my own book, which of course I have to assign, I'm assigning a book that I think is extremely shrewd, but it's gotten very little attention by two guys, Ivan Krasnev and Stephen Holmes. It's called The Light That Failed. It came out last year to little publicity, but it's one of the best books in explaining the shift in the geopolitical order and why the world of globalization fell apart. And they make the point, which I've seen nobody else make, that people don't like to be told, you should imitate us. And in effect, that's what we were saying. We, the globalizers, were saying to the rest of the world, you should imitate us. Russian culture should become American culture. Chinese culture should become American culture. Of course, there was a backlash against this. Yale and Harvard were saying to middle America, you should imitate us. Middle America is very different from Yale and Harvard, of course. And it's hardly surprising that there was a backlash against this. So I think this is all perfectly obvious, but nobody else that I know has said it to the extent that they have as well. So that's one of the ones that is on the list for the Fox's course. I've also been very impressed for my freshman seminar for Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, which I expect you've read.
Yes.
Which I think is a wonderful just romp through all kinds of history, and it's going to be fun to see how that works with my freshmen. I always like to give them a macro history and put it alongside a micro history, and that'll be there. But of course, Tolstoy is always in a special category, as you can tell from reading the Grand Strategy book, and I just he is endlessly rewarding. I have plowed through War and Peace, because I've been teaching it for as long as I have, 6 or 8 times. And there's something new and something rewarding in there every time I read it. And so I think it's just an amazing performance as well. And it's great fun to watch my freshmen the freshmen have to read it all the way through. Mm. And it looks very daunting on the reading list, but they just almost immediately get hooked on it, and they fall in love with it, and it's fun to watch that for sure. So it covers everything. I think that's a good enough list for the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Usually I ask and I get 1 or 2 books, but I imagine speaking with a historian, I get a lot more than 1 or 2.
Yeah, maybe, could be. Huh.
It seems so. Yeah, for my last question.
Yep.
To bring it back to our discussion of foxes and hedgehogs,
mm-hmm.
So kind of full circle, I wonder, being a teacher of history, a reader of history, a writer of history throughout your career, have you, well, in thinking in terms of a hedgehog with
mm-hmm.
one overall goal, has there been a motivation of yours underneath all of this?
To be a hedgehog?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think, what do you mean, professional motivation? Do you mean a cause, a great cause in life, or what?
I would say I think personal and professional kind of be merged.
Well, I think they do too. And I think maybe if I boil it down to any one thing, I think it's teaching. And I see, obviously, classroom instruction is teaching, but I see writing is teaching as well, research and writing. Because every one of those books, I hope, has had some implied lesson, maybe sometimes an explicit lesson. And part of the assumption that historians like to make is that historical consciousness is a good thing to have. And so I guess to the extent that there's been any consistent theme or consistent aspiration, maybe it's that. But that's what I mean about it being fun. That's what I mean about it being rewarding in an intellectual sense, but also just the astounding thing about getting paid to do it.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Historian John Gaddis.